Hello and welcome. We're now ready to begin today's webinar, Managing a Multi-Generational Workforce. My name is Virginia Boccaccio. I am a program coordinator with Rutgers Executive and Professional Education, and I will be your host and moderator for this webinar. Rutgers EPE is the proud sponsor for today's webinar, which is the third in a new series of informative sessions highlighting timely topic areas and issues in human resources, leadership, and management. Please take it away.
Well, thank you, Virginia, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I've been researching this topic of managing multi-generational workforce for some time. For more information and more research on this, I did publish a lot of the findings that we'll be talking to you about today in a book, Practices for Engaging the 21st Century Workforce, Challenges of Talent Management in a Changing Workplace. And clearly, one of the challenges that we're all facing and thinking about how do we engage workers is dealing with multi-generations working under one roof. So this is a very timely topic that's of interest to a lot of organizations. When we think about multiple generations, the real driver, obviously, of generations are population trends. And we've had some interesting trends here in the United States that are resulting in this multi-generational workforce. Now, we've had a number of major shifts in demographics. The first that we really research is about the birth dearth in the late 20s as a result of the Great Depression. That was followed after World War II by a baby boom in which birth rates accelerated rapidly, and that lasted up until about the mid-60s. And at that time, there was another shift. In the mid-60s, more women were going into universities, going into the workplace, controlling reproduction, and that resulted in a significant decline in birth rates that we now call Gen X. That was followed at around 1980 with what is commonly called the Echo Boomers, which we now call Gen Y, who are really the result of the baby boomers postponing having children until that time period. And now we seem to have another shift that's developing. Some demographers call it the millenniums, some call it Gen Z, which is around the late 1990s going into the 2000s. So this really depicts what's going on. I mean, it's the change in birth rates that have created these cohorts. So the oldest of the cohorts are the traditionalists. These are 70-plus-year-olds, many of whom are in the workplace. There was about 46 million. The baby boom had 78 million individuals born during that period of time. As a percent of the population, by far, that has always been the largest cohort. And there we're looking at a cohort of around 51 to 69 years of age. Gen X, around 50 million, we're looking at people between 36 and 50, followed by Gen Y, larger than the baby boomers, but not as large on a percent basis, 80 million strong. And these are the workers that are now moving very, very rapidly into the workplace. And these are your 20 to 35-year-olds. And I'm sure some of you have seen different studies, different researches where the ages and these years are slightly off. There's a number of different research studies on dealing with multiple generations. Why we have so many individuals working under one roof from different generations is predominantly the result of this trend. More and more older workers are staying in the workplace. In 2000, only 13% of 55-year-olds and above comprised the workforce. By 2020, they're anticipating that to be 1 in 5. So 1 in 5 workers are going to be 55 or older by 2020. So clearly the participation rate, the percent of people in this particular cohort, 55 to 64, that are in the workplace has rapidly increased from approximately 56% in 1990 to over 64% in 2012. Now, an interesting thing of what's also going on in the labor force is we're seeing significant decline in labor force growth rates. That's attributable to we have declining population trends, so our fertility rates have been consistently declining, and we're also seeing declining participation rates in both men and women, predominantly because older workers compared to younger workers have much lower participation rates. So organizations are really going to have a war for talent. And I think that's one of the real focus of this topic. We're going to have people in all age groups that are going to be critical for organizations to recruit and, more importantly, to develop and retain, particularly those who have those competencies that are critical to an organization. So right now, this study was 2010. By far the largest segment of the workplace are baby boomers, but we have 5% of the workforce of individuals that are 70 or older. The Gen X is at 32%, and right now, Gen Y is 25%, but within the next 10 years, Gen Y will be the dominant cohort in the workplace, which is why there's been so much interest in the research on Gen Y. So let's kind of look at the challenges. We have 4 generations under one roof. Clearly, they have different values. They have different preferences, work preferences, and needs. So let's get to know who these individuals are and what are the characteristics of these different generational cohorts. One way of thinking about it is to look at some of the defining events and the influences that kind of shape the personalities and the needs of these individuals. The traditionalists, most commonly known as the greatest generation, they came out of the Depression era, World War II, the New Deal. Now, I also like looking at the influences, predominantly the technological influences, as well as looking at the presidents that kind of represent that cohort. So the traditionalist, radio was the key technological trend, and FDR is the president that really reflects the values of that generation. The boomers, right, the civil rights movement, Woodstock, Vietnam, very interesting times in the United States. Television seems to be the dominant technology that defined the earlier years of the baby boomers. Kennedy, as a president that kind of represented some of the values and preferences of that generation. Gen X, very interesting times, right? They grew up with stagflation, the economy was restructuring, we've seen corporate layoffs during that period of time. Personal computers were becoming dominant during those years, and Nixon seems to kind of reflect some of the personalities and issues of that era. And then lastly, Gen Y, very interesting times, right? They grew up in a period of prosperity. We saw the fall of the Berlin Wall and all of those international changes, but also domestically, things like the Columbine massacre, it certainly shapes personalities of people growing up in those eras. And then they grew up with the World Wide Web and the internet. They totally embraced that type of technology. And then perhaps Clinton could be viewed as the president that they may most associate with or more knowledgeable of. So let's kind of look at the research and really focus on the 3 dominant cohorts given the time that we have, the boomers, the Xers, and the Yers. So the research looking at baby boomers, when we say who are they, very much work-centric seems to be a good way of describing them. They very much consider career to be their primary defining feature. Obviously, they work hard as a result of that. Very independent, right? Self-reliant, question the status quo. Not surprisingly, because they are career-oriented, they're very goal-oriented and really do focus on personal accomplishments. And as a result of their kind of moving up the corporate ladder, they're also very comfortable working in a competitive environment. When you think about what they value, they're very comfortable and value face-to-face interactions and consensus decision-making. They truly believe that people need to pay their dues. That really is attributable to their own experiences of climbing the corporate ladder, so to speak. Not surprisingly, very interested in achievement and status, particularly in the workplace. They want to have a positive legacy. but they also want to be praised and have challenges. When we think of Gen X and who they are, very different generation. You know, they grew up in a very tumultuous era. They've seen the disintegration of traditional families. But interestingly, they're very family-centric. You know, they value their role of being a parent and like that ability to balance work and family life. They saw their parents get laid off. They saw their parents, the social contract where the expectation was to be with an employer for life, disappear. So they, in turn, feel they need to be in control. They want to be independent and self-reliant. They have a very good competency in being adaptable, which is highly valuable in a workplace that has gone through the changes that they have experienced. Very entrepreneurial, innovative, again, seek to control their work and their work life. And very socially conscious, you know, highly acceptable of diversity. And interestingly, very much aware of being politically correct. When we think about what they value, they like an informal, flexible work environment, but really the key value, I think, for this generational cohort is the ability to balance work and family life. And certainly freedom and control correlate with those interests. They like strong relationships and mentorships. They seek developmental opportunities that are going to give them transferable skills in the workplace. You know, they realize that that dream of giving companies loyalty will give you job security has long disappeared. So they realize to advance in this workplace, one needs to be developed, one needs to have marketable and transferable skills, and they highly value those opportunities. Lastly, when we think about Gen Y, there's, not surprisingly, a phenomenal amount of research on this cohort. As I said, they're the dominant generation coming into the workplace, and they will be the dominant cohort in the next 10 years. Interestingly, a lot of people, when they think of Gen Y, may not think that they're achievement-oriented, but yet the research makes that conclusion. Mostly because they're very confident in their abilities, but they are very ambitious and goal-seeking. Their focus, unlike Gen X, is really more life-centric. They want to focus on their life goals, and they clearly value friends and they value family. Not surprisingly, because they grew up with technology, they are very tech-savvy, but interestingly, they're very reliant on technology. They need to be constantly connected, and that can be viewed as both a positive or a negative in the workplace. Very team-oriented. They grew up in an environment where they did get a lot of attention, a lot of doting parents. You know, seems to be evidence that resulted in them really wanting to have the ability to express themselves. They seek frequent praise and self-assurance. But they're also very open-minded, highly accepting of different views and diversity, and very civic-minded. Right? They have a very strong sense of community. When we think about what they value, they do value great learning experiences, particularly learning experiences that they could relate to their own self-interest and development. In the workplace, they're very much motivated by a challenging and having meaningful work. They like to know that they're making a difference. So perhaps there's a strong line of sight between what they're doing and organizational goals. They like very strong relationships with their fellow employees and managers. That's very important. Flexibility, but flexibility to pursue life's interest, right? As opposed to flexibility that Gen X has interest in balancing work and family. Very different. Want constant on-demand feedback and recognition. You know, from a management perspective, I think that's a big challenge for this generational cohort. They do like a fast-paced environment. They're very comfortable, not surprisingly, with cutting-edge technology, but they want to have access to cutting-edge technology. They like having fun and have the ability to be involved in their community. So what does this mean from a management perspective? I mean, clearly it's a big challenge. You go back 20, 30 years ago, we had a much more cohesive workplace. Today, when we think about managing and engaging the workforce, the key takeaway that I always focus on, there is not a one-size-fits-all. Right? You're dealing with people who have very different needs, very different preferences. So the key is to understand what are their drivers of engagement, because we know there are different drivers that do motivate these different generational cohorts. Some of the research talks about creating ideals, idiosyncratic employment arrangements. In my research, it's the differentiated workforce strategy, where you understand not only different generational cohorts, but different types of workers contributing in your organization oftentimes have to be managed with different types of HR systems. So let's kind of look at the summary of the research in this area. Women, not surprisingly, looking at their influences and looking at their values, when you're managing baby boomers, they are opposed to the old command and control management styles. They're more comfortable in flatter organizational structures, like to be empowered to make their own decisions, highly motivated by perks and prestige. Titles are important, office, location is also important for this particular cohort. Not surprisingly, given the changes that are taking place as a result of technology and globalization, that they're very much focused on valuing professional development. They realize that skills could become obsolete in a very short period of time, and being able to continue that learning experience, particularly the ability to join professional groups, highly motivating for this particular cohort. Not surprisingly, a lot of the research indicates that boomers did not save enough for retirement, so they are now beginning to focus on financial security. So they're very much interested in pension plans and 401k plans that are going to help them save money for retirement. And also, there's a growing interest in wellness programs. Not surprisingly, the boomers are now reaching that age where health is a primary concern. They're very active compared to previous generations in that age group. So offering wellness programs also can be a very key motivator for this group. We see a lot of organizations, particularly organizations that need to retain the knowledge of their older workers. And there are many industries, whether it's because of customer relationships, whether it's because of legacy systems, there is an important need to retain these individuals and to maybe put them into what we call a phased retirement program, becoming very popular at a number of organizations that allow people to start working on a part-time basis with benefits and gradually reduce those hours until they reach full retirement. And closely related to that are involvement in mentoring programs, giving them the ability to share their experience and their knowledge with younger workers. Right? And that also helps your younger employees gain the necessary knowledge for them to succeed. When we think about the research on managing Gen X, given where they are, they're kind of in the middle of those two big cohorts, they want to participate in succession planning programs. Right? They really feel that they're the next generation to replace the boomers as they start retiring. Very much focused on career development, training and development, as we talked about previously, that gives them transferable skills. Very much interested in tuition reimbursement, particularly for continuing education. So not necessarily going out and getting a degree, which is important, but also continuing education through certificate programs and the like. They want support for career advancement, so job posting systems and mobility systems are things that they're very much interested in. Not surprisingly, given their interest in control. They want to be empowered. They want to work in organizations that design jobs, that give them the authority to make decisions regarding how work is done, perhaps where it's done and when it's done. They like to work on projects that interest them. And as we mentioned before, they like flexible work arrangements predominantly because they have that strong interest in wanting to balance their work and their family life. So that's very motivating to them, and that's the type of benefit programs that they seek in the workplace. And then lastly, when we think about managing Gen Y, they expect a fast-track career. The problem, particularly if they're being managed by baby boomers, is they don't buy into this need that you have to pay your dues, and that possibly can create some conflicts. They do desire and seek meaningful and challenging work. That's a real big driver of engagement for this generational cohort. It is for almost all the cohorts, but it's off the chart when it comes to Gen Y. They like a collaborative rather than a competitive work environment. We talked about their real interest in how they appreciate feedback and recognition, but they do like feedback almost on demand. They prefer, not surprisingly, an informal, less personal communication style. When it comes to communicating, they much prefer using technology, texting, and all the other types of platforms that are available to them. When it comes to training and development, they do want that to focus not only on career advancement, but also on self-improvement. And interestingly, we see this common theme about flexibility. So in my research, I talk a lot about that and how flexibility is really a driver of engagement across all the generational cohorts. But it's interesting to see it's motivating to these generational cohorts for different reasons. The baby boomers, to help them perhaps phase into retirement. The Gen X's, to give them the flexibility to balance work and family life. And when it comes to Gen Y, they like flexibility to balance work and their personal life and pursue life's interest. That's why volunteerism is very motivating to them as well. And that kind of correlates with their social consciousness as well. Not surprisingly, we talked about the desire for a fun work environment. They like informal dress. They don't like to work in very conservative-oriented workplaces. They seek a lot of leisure activities with their work colleagues. They like these high-quality relationships. And when it comes to perks for this generational cohort, they're more interested in things like having an on-site gym, perhaps having some free food, the ability to have these kind of work outings where people can get to know each other, very different than the perks, say, that a baby boomer is going to be motivated with when it comes to prestige and titles and the like. Now, I always make the point, when we talk about these cohorts, these are generalizations. And there's a lot of research that supports this information that we've been discussing, but I always make it the point to tell people that these are generalizations. I mean, I know plenty of Gen Ys that are as competitive as a baby boomer, and I know plenty of boomers that have a lot of the characteristics of a Gen Y. So I think you need to look at these things in their proper context. So given the time that we have, that's an awful lot of research that I try to give in this period of time, but I also like the opportunity to answer some of your questions. I know Virginia gave you instructions about how to submit your questions, and I'm going to now pass the baton over to Virginia to have her tell me what these questions are. Virginia?
Okay, great. Thank you, Bill. We have received some questions during the presentation, and our first question is, how can organizations assess what motivates and engages these different generational cohorts?
That's an excellent question. It really kind of ties in with what I was saying at the very end. I think first and foremost is to have a good measure of engagement, right? And I think it's important to separate the measures from engagement and the drivers of engagement. So a lot of the things we discussed in this webinar, I would consider to be the drivers. So by surveying your employees and having a true measure of engagement, you have the ability then to analyze which of those drivers is moving that needle on engagement for these different generational cohorts. And that's how a lot of this research is developed. You may find that your Gen Y wants flexibility. You may find your Gen X may be really motivated by development. So I think the key is separating the drivers and the measure of engagement so that you can do that analysis when you collect the data with an engagement survey. Good question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our second question is, how can colleagues from different generations improve their way of communicating with each other when their communication preference styles are different?
That is a big challenge. You can clearly see there are different interests and preferences in how these different generations have been used to communicating, from memo writing and face-to-face communications, from traditionalists to baby boomers to moving more towards technology when it comes to X's and Y's. I think what I'm seeing in a lot of companies that makes sense is take time out using technology. I think it could become overwhelming when everybody is constantly connected, constantly on their emails, constantly texting. Clearly there are advantages to be able to do that, but more and more companies are taking time out and encouraging people, particularly during that time period, to do more face-to-face meetings. And I think that gives all the generations an appreciation that there are different ways of communicating, and begin to understand that different people who you work with, different people who you work for, may have a preference to either a face-to-face communication or using technology to communicate. So I think you need to balance both. And you don't want to have meetings just for the sake of having meetings, right? So I think you need to be also very, very careful when you do schedule meetings that there's a specific objective, a specific outcome, and you balance that with, as I said before, using technology. Good question.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our last question is, are there any tips you can provide for a new Gen Y supervisor managing those from the baby boomer generation?
Yes, well, you are seeing that more and more common, particularly in this fast-paced world of ours where technology can become obsolete in a very, very short period of time. You may find yourself with a younger worker who has that experience and knowledge to be managing a group that also may consist of older workers, baby boomers and the like. I think the key, looking at what motivates boomers, is to make sure that they would respect their experience, right? Acknowledge their experience, recognize their contributions. I think provide them with very specific objectives, but then give them the ability to follow up on their own, basically empower them to do it their way. And then overall recognize the values and contributions they make to the team. I think that's the kind of motivation that a boomer, particularly working for a wire, would appreciate.
Bill, we actually just had one more question come in. I think we have time for one more. And the question is, do you recommend customizing programs or incentives geared only towards one generation or another? And is it okay to exclude groups from programs based on their generation?
Good question. I wouldn't necessarily communicate and create programs specifically for a cohort. I think the key is to have a variety of policies and programs that are going to be attractive to different employees. So if you did the analysis that I described before, I may come to the conclusion that flexible work schedules are going to be very motivating for one group of employees, and career advancement and development is really going to be a key motivator for a different set of employees. But I don't necessarily, and should not, I believe, communicate those policies that way. I think my takeaway in analyzing those results would be we should offer all of our employees these programs and options, and then clearly see who's going to sign up. You'll find that different employees may have different interests in those kinds of policies and programs that an organization will be offering. So it's important to make these programs available to all of your employees, and clearly you'll need to have criteria and eligibility requirements, but those eligibility requirements should never be based on age. Right? I think that you would be going down a slippery slope if you went down that path. But having kind of a toolkit is how I like to describe it, of different policies and different programs that you feel are going to motivate your employees collectively. Good question.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was our last question. So, Bill, thank you for this great presentation and for your time today. And as a thank you to the participants for joining us in today's webinar, we'd like to extend a 20% discount on EPE programs offered this fall in Human Resources, Leadership, Management, and Project Management. You'd go to our website, epe.rutgers.edu, and use the discount code webinar092315. For more research on today's topic, Dr. Castellano will be instructing HR strategy development on September 28th from 6 to 9 in our Piscataway location, and also practices for engaging the 21st century workforce on November 2nd from 9 to noon, also in Piscataway. So this concludes today's webinar. As I mentioned earlier, a link to the archived recording of the presentation will be sent to you shortly. If we've missed any of your questions or would like to send any of your questions to us, please do so. You would send that to info, I-N-F-O, @epe.rutgers.edu, and we'll get a response over to you. And if there are any topics you would like to see covered in our webinar series, please email us again at info, I-N-F-O, @epe.rutgers.edu. And thank you very much.
Thank you.